I have always considered myself a happy person. I lived in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of an American city in Maryland, where everyone was friendly and knew each other by name. I had a cozy house with a small garden where I liked to grow flowers and vegetables. I worked for a small real estate firm, and I loved my job. I enjoyed helping people find their dream homes and making them happy. I had a beloved dog, Bella, who was my faithful friend and companion. She was a golden retriever, and she had the most adorable face and the softest fur. We used to go for walks every day, and she always greeted me with enthusiasm when I came home. For many years, my life here seemed ordinary and serene. But one day, a series of events occurred that changed my view of our quiet street forever. It all started a few months ago when I first noticed strange noises coming from my neighbor John's house. John was a tall and unassuming middle-aged man who didn't seem to stand out in any way among our neighbors. He had short brown hair, glasses, and a plain wardrobe. He always said hello politely, but kept relatively aloof, and I knew little about his personal life. He lived alone, and I never saw him have any guests or relatives. He worked in some kind of science lab, but he didn't talk about his work. He seemed to be a quiet and harmless person, but there was something about him that made me feel uneasy. That evening was as usual, and I went for a walk with my dog Bella. It was already dark, and the street was practically empty. As I passed John's house, I suddenly heard something strange. It was muffled moans and what sounded like someone's heavy breathing. It sounded like someone was in pain or distress. I stopped and listened, but all I could see was a light in the window of his house. The curtains were drawn, and I couldn't see anything inside. I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, so I walked on. But the strange events continued. A few weeks later, as I was coming home late at night after work, I heard a loud chant coming from John's house. John's voice sounded angry, and he was yelling at someone on the phone. It sounded like he was having an argument with someone who had betrayed him or done something wrong to him. He used harsh words and threats that made me shiver. I moved closer to the window and saw him thrashing around the room, appearing to be furious. He threw things around, smashed furniture, and tore up papers. Then he suddenly threw himself on the floor and started beating his fists on the wall while making horrible noises. This incident stunned me. I could not understand what could have caused my neighbor to go on such a rampage. What could have happened to him that made him so angry? Who was he talking to on the phone? Was he in some kind of trouble? Cautiously, I stepped back to the side of my house and decided not to interfere. I was afraid that it might be some kind of family conflict or personal crisis, and I had better not interfere in the affairs of others. But the real horror caught up with me when I accidentally stumbled through the open door of John's barn. That moment is still a nightmare in my dreams. I walked into the barn and found there a frightening sight that I can't forget to this day. Hanging from chains were animal corpses. There were cats, dogs, and even birds. All of them were killed and mutilated. I couldn't believe my eyes. How could such a thing be done? My fear mixed with disgust, and my hands shook as I realized I was standing in front of something horrible and incomprehensible. Without hesitation, I ran straight into the house and called the police. My trembling hand barely dialed the number as I told the dispatcher what I had seen. The police arrived quickly, and the officers inspected John's shed. Their facial expressions spoke for themselves. It was a terrible crime, and they began to investigate. A few weeks later, it turned out that John had a long history of infractions. It turned out that not only had he engaged in animal abuse, but he also had violations against women. John was arrested and will stand trial. My neighbors and I were relieved that this monster would no longer be able to harm others. But even now that John's in jail, I still have nightmares from those terrible events. I can no longer look at our quiet street the way I used to. I realize now that behind the peaceful facade of houses can hide the darkest secrets. This story will always remind me that you can never be sure who lives next door to you. My name is Lisa, and I live in a nice and quiet neighborhood. I have a husband, Tom, and a daughter, Emmy, who is 6 years old. We moved here 2 years ago, and we love our new home. It's spacious, cozy, and has a beautiful garden. Our neighbors are friendly and helpful, and we often have barbecues and parties together. But there is one thing that bothers me about our neighborhood. It's the house across the street. The house across the street is old and dilapidated. It has boarded up windows, peeling paint, and overgrown weeds. It looks like it hasn't been lived in for years, but I know that's not true. There is someone living in that house. Someone who never comes out. Someone who watches us. I first noticed him when we moved in. I was unpacking some boxes in the living room when I saw a pair of eyes staring at me from behind the curtains of the house across the street. They were dark and cold, and they made me shiver. I quickly looked away and pretended that I didn't see anything. But I did see him again. And again. And again. Every time I looked out of the window, I saw him. He was always there, watching me, watching my family, watching our every move. He never blinked, he never smiled, he never waved. He just watched. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't. He made me feel uneasy and paranoid. I wondered who he was, what he wanted, why he was watching us. I asked my neighbors about him, but they didn't know anything. They said they had never seen him before, and that they thought the house was empty. They said they had tried to contact the owner of the house, but they had no luck. They said they had called the police once, but they had found nothing suspicious. They said I was imagining things, but I wasn't. He was real, and he was getting closer. One night, when Tom was away on a business trip, and Annie was asleep in her room, I heard a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw him. He was standing on my porch, wearing a black hooded cloak that covered his face. He had a large knife in his hand. He had a twisted grin on his lips. He said in a raspy voice, "Hello, neighbor. Can I come in?" I screamed and slammed the door. I locked it and ran to the phone. I dialed 911. But before I could say anything, he kicked the door open and rushed inside. I dropped the phone and ran to Emmy's room. I locked the door behind me and hugged Emmy tight. She woke up and asked me what was wrong. I told her to be quiet and stay calm. He banged on the door and shouted, "Open up! Open up! I just want to talk to you." I ignored him and looked for something to defend myself with. I found a pair of scissors on Emmy's desk. I held them in my hand and waited for him to break in. He broke in. He smashed the door with his knife and entered the room. He saw me and Emmy on the bed. He laughed and said, "There you are. Don't be afraid. I'm your neighbor. I'm here to help you." He lunged at us with his knife. I stabbed him with the scissors. I stabbed him in the eye. He screamed and dropped to the floor, clutching his injured eye. Blood poured from the wound, staining the carpet in a gruesome pool. Amy and I stared in horror at the intruder, whose sinister grin had turned into a mask of pain and rage. Desperation took over as I realized that I had to protect my daughter and myself. I grabbed Amy's hand and rushed out of her room, making a beeline for the front door. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the keys, praying that I could get us out of there before the man recovered. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard him stumbling after us, cursing and yelling obscenities. The front door swung open just in time, and we bolted outside into the darkness of the night. I didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our neighbor's house next door. Terrified and breathless, I pounded on their door, and it was Sarah, our neighbor, who answered. She gasped at the sight of us, covered in sweat and fear, and quickly ushered us inside. I explained what had happened, and she immediately called the police while her husband John went over to investigate the situation. The police arrived within minutes, and Sarah and I watched anxiously as they entered our home with their weapons drawn. Moments later, they emerged with the hooded man in handcuffs, his eyes still bleeding. It turned out that our neighbors had seen him enter our house and had called the police as well when they heard the commotion. The man was arrested, and we learned that he had a long history of mental illness and had recently been released from a nearby psychiatric hospital. He had fixated on our family for reasons unknown, and had been living secretly in the abandoned house across the street, watching our every move. My heart was still racing as the police assured us that the man would be taken back to the psychiatric facility. I am Tom, and I live in a small apartment in the city. I have a normal life, with a normal job and normal friends. I have nothing to complain about, except for one thing. My neighbor. He lives in the apartment across the hall from mine, and he is the weirdest person I have ever met. He never leaves his apartment, except for once a week, when he goes to the grocery store. He never talks to anyone, except for me, when he occasionally knocks on my door and asks me for some random favor. He never makes any noise, except for sometimes at night, when I hear him humming or singing some creepy tune. He looks like he is in his 60s, but he has a youthful energy that is unsettling. He has long grey hair that covers his face and piercing blue eyes that stare right through you. He wears old-fashioned clothes that are too big for him, and he always carries a leather briefcase that he never opens. He says his name is Mr. Smith, but I doubt that is his real name. He says he is a writer, but I have never seen any of his books. He says he is harmless, but I have a feeling that he is hiding something. Something dark. Something dangerous. Something that has to do with his briefcase. I have always been curious about what's inside his briefcase, but I have never dared to ask him. I have tried to peek inside when he opens his door, but he always keeps it close to his chest. I have wondered if he has some kind of weapon, or some kind of treasure, or some kind of secret. But I never expected to find out the truth. It happened last night, when I was coming back from work. I saw him standing outside his door, holding his briefcase in one hand and a knife in the other. He had blood on his clothes and a crazed look on his face. He saw me and smiled. "Hello, Tom," he said. "I'm glad you're here. I have something to show you." He opened his briefcase and revealed its contents. I gasped. Inside the briefcase, there were dozens of human ears. Ears of different shapes and sizes. Ears of different colors and textures. Ears that had been cut off. I couldn't believe my eyes. The grotesque sight before me sent shivers down my spine. Dozens of human ears, each more macabre than the last, were neatly arranged inside Mr. Smith's leather briefcase. They glistened with fresh blood, and their pallid appearance made it clear that they were recently severed. Mr. Smith continued to smile, his unnerving blue eyes fixed on me as if daring me to react. My mind raced with terror, trying to process the horrific tableau that stood before me. What? What is this? What have you done? I stammered, taking a step back from the grisly scene. Mr. Smith's voice was strangely calm, as if he were discussing the weather. "You see, Tom, I'm an artist. These are my creations, my masterpieces." The absurdity of his statement only added to my growing dread. "Creations, masterpieces. Those are human ears," I exclaimed, my voice trembling. Mr. Smith chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. "Oh, Tom, you don't understand. These ears are not mere body parts. They are a canvas for the stories of the city, the whispers of its people." I felt my knees weaken as fear threatened to overwhelm me. "You're insane." He tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating my words. "Perhaps, but isn't insanity just a different perspective on reality?" I've collected these ears over the years to capture the essence of this city, its hidden stories, its silenced voices. I couldn't bear to look at the gruesome collection any longer. My thoughts raced, searching for an escape from this madness. I have to call the police. Mr. Smith's smile faded, replaced by an unsettling intensity. No, Tom, you won't do that. You see, you're a part of this now. Before I could react, he lunged toward me, the knife glinting menacingly. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the razor-sharp blade. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I fled down the hallway, the sound of his manic laughter echoing behind me. I didn't know where to turn. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that Mr. Smith knew where I lived, where I worked, and who my friends were. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the authorities, as Mr. Smith's eerie charm and uncanny ability to evade notice seemed almost supernatural. Days turned into weeks as I lived in constant fear, haunted by the memory of the gruesome discovery in Mr. Smith's briefcase. I avoided my apartment whenever possible, saying the friends were sleeping in my car, but I knew I couldn't run forever. One fateful night, as I returned to my apartment, I noticed something unusual. The hallway was eerily silent, devoid of any sounds. As I cautiously approached my door, a sense of dread washed over me. I knew something was terribly wrong. When I entered my apartment, I found it in disarray. Furniture was overturned, and my belongings were scattered across the floor. It was clear that someone had been here, searching for something. My heart sank as I realized what they were looking for, the evidence of my knowledge about Mr. Smith. I raced to my neighbor's door, hoping to confront him or find some answers. But when I reached his apartment, it was empty. Mr. Smith had vanished, leaving no trace behind. It was as if he had never existed. The police were of little help, dismissing my story as a figment of my imagination. They found no evidence of the gruesome collection of ears or Mr. Smith's involvement in any criminal activities. I was left alone, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. To this day, I live in fear, constantly watching over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of Mr. Smith and the horrifying secrets he kept hidden in that leather briefcase. I can't escape the feeling that he's still out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to reclaim the dark secrets he so carefully guarded.